To order. This is meeting number 68 of the Standing Committee on Health in the 42nd Parliament. And pursuant to order reference of Thursday, June the 8th, we're studying an act respecting cannabis. And we welcome our guests. Our focus of our meeting, on this panel, is the municipalities and the impact on municipalities and the challenges they will face. And for witnesses, we have from the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, we have Ms. Lisa Holmes, President. Welcome. From Cannabis Culture, we have Jody Emery and Mark Emery. Welcome. And by video conference from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, we have Brock Carlton, Chief Executive Officer, who's in Fort McMurray, along with his friend Bill Karsten, the Second Vice President and also Councillor from the Municipality of Halifax. By video conference, they're both at Fort McMurray, and we'll be hearing from you shortly. But the way we start is we offer each organization 10 minutes for an opening statement. And then we go to questions. So we'll start in the order that I introduced you with the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association. Mayor Emery, if you would give us your thoughts for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address your committee today. My name is Lisa Holmes. I am the Mayor of Morinville, Alberta, and the President of the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, which is also known as AUMA. AUMA is an association of all urban municipalities in Alberta, spanning all types of villages, towns, and cities, including Edmonton and Calgary, who collectively are home to almost 90% of Alberta's population. AUMA was the first provincial association of municipalities in Canada to take action on addressing the potential health and safety implications coming from the legalization of cannabis. Several years ago, we struck a working group to develop recommendations relating to medical cannabis production facilities and actions to address illegal grow-ops. Since then, and since the announcement of the government's desire to legalize cannabis, we have been working with other associations across Canada to proactively identify the importance of an integrated approach between the federal, provincial, and municipal governments on the implementation of Bill C45. It is our desire to find ways for our three levels of government to collectively ensure appropriate systems are in place to educate the public, restrict inappropriate usage, address health and safety issues, and enable coordinated enforcement. Our concern is with the timing of these conversations taking place. AUMA strongly supports a slower timeline for implementing this legislation, given the complex nature of the health and safety issues that need to be resolved and the need for comprehensive and coordinated legislation by all three levels of government. The speed at which the federal government intends to move ahead puts our local communities at risk. The federal government must lead this process at a much more measured pace and allow both provincial and municipal governments to work together to create an appropriate framework for each province. The provincial regulations, including those related to alcohol and drugs, traffic safety and employment standards, need to be developed well in advance of the federal implementation date. To be frank, with this issue, we do not feel at AUMA that municipalities are being treated as an equal partner at the planning table. And it is imperative that all three levels of government should be given appropriate time and support in order to prepare all of the required regulations and bylaws that are necessary for the areas we are each responsible for. Municipalities will be at the front line of this. We are the level of government that's within the local community. We are operating closest to the people, and we will be the ones that have to implement, enforce, and address the impacts of this new regulatory regime. Our members are concerned about the downloading of these new duties related to cannabis legislation without accompanying resources to ensure that the duties, particularly enforcement, can be effectively conducted. Funding and resources must be made available to municipalities to develop capacity and to offset administrative costs around licensing, education, inspection, and enforcement. Equipment and training costs related to enforcement must be fully funded through either a cannabis tax or by the federal or provincial government, so costs are not downloaded onto our local communities. With respect to health and safety matters, AUMA supports the federal task force recommendation around minimum age of purchase, advertising and promotion, packaging and labeling, and public education strategies. That being said, provided municipal governments are engaged in any of these matters impacting them, as legislation and regulations are developed. Public education with respect to potential risks and harms of cannabis must be a political and policy priority for this federal government. We support early and intensive public education as well as an approach to packaging, marketing, and advertising similar to that of tobacco in order to limit the appeal of cannabis to youth. These health and safety issues span the production, distribution, and consumption of cannabis. For example, municipalities had been advocating for sufficient fire and building code changes to regulate the growth of cannabis, particularly in residential properties, so that current and prospective property owners are protected from the adverse effects that a home grow can create. As well, the sale of cannabis products need to be carefully considered to ensure it eliminates the illegal drug market, while not occurring in a way that is dangerous to youth or others in our communities. Municipalities will work with you to do that by setting out restrictions on where cannabis is publicly consumed. But however, around 96% of the urban municipalities in Alberta have yet to enact bylaws or policies that regulate the use of cannabis in their communities, because the lack of information and certainty around what will be included in the regulations, both federally and provincially, don't allow us to move forward. And most of the municipalities that have started to work on this have only extended their current policy and bylaw around smoking to include smoking cannabis products. There is a significant amount of work we have to do, and municipalities will be left with little or no time after the federal and provincial frameworks are adopted in order to put our own bylaws and policies in place that are necessary to keep our communities safe. Again, it is our belief that production, distribution, and consumption of cannabis raises significant health and safety concerns in the local community. Given that actual enforcement will take place at the local level, the federal government should engage with municipal governments and police forces to determine the best method of achieving their overarching objective to minimize harm. AUMA did a survey of our membership and found the #1 issue that urban municipalities in Alberta are concerned about regarding this legislation is public safety issues, such as impaired driving and policing and enforcement. Given the limitations within the current testing available for cannabis impairment, AUMA believes the additional rules to discourage drug-impaired driving, such as a per-se limit, should not be put into place until there is a robust body of evidence and reliable testing mechanism to support the measurement of impairment at a time a person is driving. We recommend the federal government invest in research to better link drug levels with impairment and crash risk, and a national comprehensive public education strategy to send a clear message that cannabis causes impairment and the best way to avoid driving impaired is not to consume. In Alberta, our protective services do not just include the RCMP, but also municipal police forces, community peace officers, and bylaw officers. All of these groups must be a component of the enforcement activities and require funded training and equipment relating to traffic safety, so they can detain potential offenders until other law enforcement agencies can validate and, if necessary, lay charges. The training and equipment required is very expensive, and that is not a cost our municipalities, especially the small ones, can absorb. It is concerning to us as municipal elected officials to hear from the RCMP that we contract to police our communities that they will not have enough time to train their officers before the July 2018 implementation date. Without that training and the equipment necessary for the enforcement of these regulations, the laws and bylaws, there is a lack of confidence from Alberta municipalities that we can meet one of our core mandates, ensuring the highest degree of safety and security for our community. Again, I offer our suggestion that the federal government take a measured and phased-in approach to cannabis legislation. This approach is essential, as we are working within a complex environment. And although many of us are trying to predict what will happen, none of us can claim to know exactly what outcomes will arise as a result of this legislation. This approach will provide opportunity to adjust strategies as required after all 3 levels of government and the stakeholders have the time to assess how this legislation and corresponding regulations will impact them. Our main ask is simple: slow down, learn from other jurisdictions, and provide time for all of us to get this right the first time. I appreciate this opportunity to bring forward the comments from AUMA, and I'm available if you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Holmes. Now we go to cannabis culture for 10 minutes. I believe, Mark Emery, you're going to open for 5 minutes and then share 5 minutes. Okay.
I look forward to the 5, Mr. Chair. And thank you for inviting us. We are from Cannabis Culture, which is an activist organization since 1994 that's been dedicated to overgrowing this government, which in our language is to legalize this government. I said overgrow, not the throw. And It's important, all due respect that this is the Health Committee, but you know, marijuana is one of the safest substances on earth. And I walk down Spark Street, and it's safer than every product they're selling there. It's safer than candy, it's safer than eating at McDonald's, it's safer than prescription drugs, tobacco, alcohol, all of which is commonly available on this street. It's safer than cheerleading in high school, it's safer than football in high school, it's safer than hockey in high school. You could rarely make a more safe choice than choosing to use cannabis for whatever reason. And that's why I think it's wholly unworthy of a parliament to spend a whole week discussing the health concerns of a substance that has not killed anybody while being supplied by the free market, some call it the black market, for the last 50 years. Imagine, can you conceptualize any other product that hasn't killed anyone in 50 years? Cars kill people all the time, alcohol, tobacco, prescription drugs, foods kill people, obesity kills people. Everything you do in the society out there, exercising your own bodily autonomy, guaranteed to us by the Supreme Court in the Morgenthaler case, to control our own bodies, there are few things you could take that are not more harmful than cannabis. In fact, even government-approved water in Walkerton, Ontario has killed 8 people. So water is more dangerous than marijuana, realistically. This should be at the Justice Committee. And the reason is I've been in 36 prisons and jails for pot. I was exiled by my own government for 5 years to the United States for selling seeds by mail. Can you imagine? This country was founded on agriculture and farming, and yet I spent 5 years in jail, co-authorized by my own government, because I sent seeds to willing adults to plant plants. We've come to this. The Justice Committee should be looking at this because 2,400,000 Canadians have been criminalized with charges of cannabis offenses since 1965. There is nothing else in this country remotely close to 2.4 million people getting charged for doing something they love, which is growing or selling or consuming marijuana, and harming no one else. If we've got organized crime in there, it's because you created it. Had you not criminalized marijuana, nobody would be handling marijuana except organized, regular retailers in our usual business regime. So you're the problem. You're at fault. We've had prohibition for 93 years. I've never seen Parliament modernize it or ameliorate the terrible things in any of that time. I spent 3 months in Saskatoon Correctional for passing 1 joint. I was sent to the United States for 5 years for sending seeds to Americans. And we have done every manner of disobedience. Like I say, I've been arrested probably at least 27 or 8 times, and I've been jailed 36 times. I've been jailed in 9 out of 10 provinces for my activism. I've seen prisons in this country. And we need to get rid of this criminalization. And the legalization that everybody really wanted when we thought we were electing Mr. Trudeau and his platform was simply the way it was brought in. In 1923, the Justice Minister got up in the Parliament and said, "Mr. Speaker, we've added a new drug to the schedule." And that was it. No other discussion, nothing else. So you can legalize it in the exact same way. Mr. Speaker, we've removed cannabis from the schedule. That's the only legalization that's really permissible. It's the only one that's really legalization. Everything else is a recriminalization. In fact, I dare say there are more criminal offenses in the new Cannabis Act than there currently are in the existing legislation. So you're actually broadening it to include more people with more offenses, and virtually everybody who needs to be legalized, all the growers in this country, all the sellers, and all the consumers, they will still be criminalized under this Cannabis Act. Only licensed producers, a very small minority, are going to be allowed to grow marijuana. You can't possess marijuana that doesn't even come from a licensed producer or some Ontario government monopoly or Quebec government monopoly or New Brunswick government monopoly as they're going. So now, before at least we were only criminalized. Now we're going to be criminalized and exploited by our own governments. We're going to be used as a cash cow, having our own culture usurped from us and handed over to a bunch of bureaucrats and politicians who probably never smoked pot in their life, don't understand anything about these people, don't understand anything about us, and it's a total insult to about 5 million Canadians who adore this plant, love this plant, use this plant, consume it, sell it, grow it, and have been involved their whole lives like I have in this plant. And to listen to this kind of discussion, the government that's oppressed us is going to come and be our liberators and hand us and dole us out like we're children. Children, we're being condescended to in the worst possible way. We're adults. We make choices. If you're concerned about children, great, deal with that. But for most of the country who smokes marijuana, they're 18 years to 80 years old. Thank you, Mr. Casey. That's 5 minutes. I'll let my wife continue. She's going to tell you how great marijuana is.
I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak here. And I represent, I believe, the victims of prohibition while I'm here. We've heard from a lot of experts and bureaucrats and a lot of people who have a lot to say, and it's fantastic that we're having this discussion. The idea that we're sitting here today talking about legalization in this country, it means a lot to me personally. I campaigned for the Liberals as a nomination candidate because I believed in legalization. Because not only am I currently a victim of prohibition myself, out on bail before you here after being arrested 6 months ago, but prior to that I was a drug war widow. I spent years with my husband taken away from me and imprisoned in a foreign country he had never been to, with the Drug Enforcement Administration saying very clearly it was because of his legalization activism and because he gave millions of dollars to legalization reform groups around the world. That's the DEA's own chief, Karen Tandy, and it's a press release you can easily see. So he says it was for seeds, but the U.S. government says it was for legalization activism. We're here to talk about legalizing cannabis, which means we should not have any law enforcement concerns. If it's going to be legal, law enforcement should be able to focus on actual crimes with real victims like rape, assault, murder, theft. I have law enforcement family members. My aunt and uncle are in Alberta with the RCMP and work with MAD. My sister is also with the Vancouver Police Department. I care about law enforcement. I care about the laws. I care about this country and our citizens. But our country and these laws and our citizens are harmed by this prohibition and by any criminalization of cannabis. Even if cannabis was dangerous, even if it killed people every day and contributed to rape and assault and murder of our young adults all across this country like alcohol does, it shouldn't be illegal. We should have the free choice to consume or grow or share a plant that isn't just benign or neutral. As you've heard, it actually helps people. It actually saves lives. And I know we only have a few minutes here, but I want to try and cite, if you'll read my brief, I submitted 10 pages, reduced to 5. But let's look at the actual health impact of cannabis. The American Journal of Medicine in 2013 and the Journal of Health Economics in 2017 said cannabis use reduces obesity. It results in healthier, thinner consumers. The Journal of the American Medical Association in 2015 said cannabis is medicine. The Journal of the American Medical Association in 2012 said a 20-year study found no damage to lungs from cannabis. This is backed up by Dr. Donald Tashkin, whom the U.S. government asked to prove it causes lung cancer. They found it actually prevents it. You can go to cancer.gov. The U.S. government says that cannabis and cannabinoids attack and kill cancer cells. They shrink brain cancer cells. That's the Journal of Molecular Cancer Therapies of 2014. You've got the American Journal of Public Health in 2014 saying that cannabis access reduces suicide rates. My father took his life when I was 9. This gold necklace here was his. I was on antidepressants for many years, and they caused me harm. And we heard just yesterday that antidepressants increase suicide rates by 33%. That's why I got off of antidepressants, and I used cannabis instead. I use legal cannabis because I'm out on bail, so I'm not allowed to go to a dispensary, but I'm going to just show you here. This is a marijuana joint. This is what we're here to talk about. This is cannabis, and it's not hurting anybody. But I've been inside the U.S. prison system, and I'll tell you, I didn't cry for myself or my husband as victims of prohibition. I cried for the children and the mothers and the families who were there visiting their loved ones, the little babies who saw their daddy on the other side of the visiting room. And they said, why is my daddy here? He didn't hurt anybody. They say prisoners are bad, but my dad, he's not bad, is he? And the moms are trying not to cry, and these little kids are saying, Mom, please don't cry, please be brave. These are the victims of cannabis prohibition. Cannabis prohibition has far more victims and far more devastation than cannabis ever could. And right now we do have a drug crisis in this country. It's the opioid crisis. None of you here have not heard of it. And you have the United States National Institute on Drug Abuse saying that cannabis dispensaries reduce opioid deaths. You've got so much evidence showing that even the Harvard study of Frontiers in Pharmacology says it improves cognitive functioning. The American Psychological Association in 2015 said teens, even chronic users, do not have later issues. The British Journal, they find cannabis is the safest substance. So I get emotional here because I followed the law. Every year my husband was incarcerated, I had to cross that U.S. border, knowing they could ask me if I used pot and I could be denied the ability to see my husband. And I managed to get through because I followed the rules as closely as I could. And then we decided to engage in peaceful civil disobedience, just like Dr. Henry Morgentaler, who received the Order of Canada for breaking the law to provide a much-needed service. Civil disobedience is the only way we've managed to change these laws in this country with respect to cannabis.
I really appreciate your passion and your commitment to this, and you're going to have lots of chance to answer questions and provide information. But I have to move along to the other speakers.
Absolutely.
But we appreciate your contribution. Okay, now we're going to go to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for 10 minutes. I'm not sure, are you going to divide the time, or is one Mr. Karsten? All right.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having us here today. And certainly, we also want to thank you for the important work that you and your committee are doing. As we know, Mr. Chair, we are here today to discuss the legislative and regulatory realities of legalizing recreational cannabis in this country. Because there's no doubt you will agree, this needs to roll out safely and effectively for all Canadians. And there's absolutely, however, nothing automatic about this. This will require strong coordination across all orders of government, and the role of local governments, I believe, is critical. FCM's National Board, Mr. Chair, met this week in Wood Buffalo, Alberta, and trust me when I say that Bill C45 loomed high on the agenda. Further to that meeting, I have clear recommendations to share with you today, but before I do that, and this is how we'll sort of share a little wee bit of the 10 minutes, I would like to introduce to you FCM's Chief Executive Officer, Brock Carlton, and I'd like to pass the next few minutes over to him.
Right.
Brock?
Thanks very much, Bill. As you may know, FCM's 2,000 member municipalities represent 90% of Canadians in every region and province and territory, big cities, rural towns, and northern and remote areas. Our communities are where people live, work, raise their families. Often when federal plans move forward, this is where the rubber hits the road. De toute évidence, c'est dans nos collectivités.
Clearly, it is in our communities that cannabis will be sold and used. Municipal governments will be therefore on the front lines when regulations will come into force throughout Canada. FCM members are already your eyes and ears. We know how cannabis regulations are applied, both for medicinal and illicit marijuana in a rapidly evolving market. And we know how changes can either improve or upset cities and municipalities across Canada. Canadians need this local expertise to help create legislation on recreational cannabis use. On the local level, enforcing this new legislation will be a monumental task. And this task will hinge greatly on upcoming measures taken by federal and provincial governments. And this is another reason why we have to make sure that municipalities participate in this process and they know what to expect.
Time and again, when the federal government systematically engages with local governments, Canadians win. It's true for infrastructure, for economic growth, for public safety, and it will be true for recreational cannabis. It's important to understand that FCM is ready and a willing partner in moving forward safely and effectively. And now I'd like to turn it back to Vice President Karsten to talk about our specific recommendations.
Great. Thank you very much, Brock. Mr. Chair, before I get started, should you or your committee hear some background noise, we are here in Wood Buffalo, and the building we're at is going to have a huge rally tonight for, what do you call those?
Monster trucks.
Monster trucks, okay? So they're doing a little wee bit of construction here. Again, thank you, Brock. Committee members, the fact is that passing Bill C45 will trigger an extensive implementation process across all orders of government, and I'd like to place emphasis on what our member from Alberta said, all orders of government. Municipalities will have to adapt local bylaws, rules, and programs as a direct result for things like zoning, land use, business licensing, enforcement, and much more. But much of this work will stem from regulatory frameworks that federal and provincial and territorial governments still have to design and build. FCM is pleased and proud that we have published a legalization primer for our members from coast to coast to coast, and a fuller guideline and guidebook is being initiated and is on its way to our members. These tools will help our municipalities from coast to coast to coast get moving on issues that they can address immediately and build work plans for the remainder. But for the work plans to succeed, Mr. Chair, municipalities need clarity and engagement on a whole range of various issues. So our first recommendation is that federal government coordinate with all orders of government to develop its regulatory framework for Bill C45. The key, we believe, to meeting a July 2018 launch timeline safely and effectively, and again I emphasize safely and effectively, will be concurrent legislative, regulatory, and bylaw development by all orders of government. We'll inch forward locally based on what we see our federal, provincial, and territory partners doing. And those partners still have important decisions to make in areas such as minimum age for consumption and what kind of retail distribution model to use. There's also much uncertainty in the area of shared responsibility for shared impact that I would like to share with you. Just a short list, things like the personal cultivation issue, workplace health and safety issues, public education, nuisance issues, municipal zoning, municipal authority to zone in cases where federal production facilities may exist, and actually others that we just haven't mentioned and listed here today. The federal government has formalized its consultation with the provinces and territories through a working group. We understand that, and that is a great first step. However, FCM would welcome sustained municipal engagement with this group to align the needs of all governments. As part of this coordination, our second recommendation then, sir, to you and your committee is to prioritize decision points that prevent local governments from moving forward with implementation work. To prioritize those decision points are critical to us safely and effectively moving this forward. There are areas where decisions at the federal, provincial, or territorial levels will drive the local response, such as provincial retail distribution models, rules around personal cultivation, as I've mentioned, First Nation and municipal boundary overlaps, which has been raised by some of our members, the authority to prohibit cannabis use and sales where applicable, and municipal options if cannabis becomes legal federally without provincial or territorial laws and regulations in place. We believe that the federal government should proactively engage with all orders of government in the coming months to ensure roles and responsibilities are very, very clearly defined. So, Mr. Chair, our third recommendation is for federal funding to defray startup costs of local implementation. There's absolutely no doubt that there is an expectation that municipalities will be on the front lines of enforcing issues such as local zoning, density bonusing, or density bylaws rather, things like rules around minimum age of purchase, personal cultivation, issues like position limits, smoking restrictions, and public nuisance complaints, which are bound to happen. Also, as alluded to earlier from the other presentation, safety concerns related to the building code. We believe these are appropriate roles for municipalities and municipalities alone. However, growing into them will definitely impose immediate costs. Municipalities just generally don't have the fiscal flexibility to invest what's needed on the required timeline. And I'm pleased to point out, Mr. Chair, that one of your committee members is in fact a former councillor in a municipality, and that your government and other members of Parliament have also served in that capacity. The federal task force acknowledged that implementation will require new capacity, and it urged federal leadership to ensure all governments grow this capacity before legislation comes into force. Before cannabis revenues start flowing, I will point out that we were pleased to announce that the government did announce funding this week for training. So, Mr. Chair, our fourth recommendation is for a smart revenue sharing model that includes all orders of government. Administration enforcement will impose ongoing costs on local governments. We are looking at additional staff time, resources for training, for public health, for licensing administration, for bylaws, etc. So there's a lot more we could add, obviously. We are equally as passionate about our points and our information as other speakers. So our final recommendation to ensure that slower than hoped cannabis revenues don't jeopardize the regime's safety and effectiveness is in fact our final recommendation. A primary objective of the Cannabis Act is to deter criminal activity. And as experts say, the way to starve the black market is to keep the price of legal cannabis low. For this reason, the Parliamentary Budget Officer warns that revenue from cannabis sales may start out small, between 356 and 959 million per year. But local governments, regardless of what that number is, will still face the significant administrative and enforcement costs. And so we need to know that federal support will be available if cannabis revenues takes time to catch up. Really, Mr. Chair, we can summarize our recommendations in two ideas. The federal government should engage municipalities in building its regulatory frameworks and revenue models, and any cannabis regime sustainability depends on equipping local governments with the tools they need to administer and enforce it, out of the gate and long term. We're proud that the municipal sector has a track record of delivering local solutions to national challenges. We look forward to working with the federal government throughout the progression of the Cannabis Act. We thank you for your time, and we also would be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation and all your points of view. And now we'll go to questions. We'll have a 7-minute question round, and we'll start with Dr. Elson.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming. I commend the FCM and the AUMA for their work on this. Quite frankly, I'm happy to see that you, both your organizations, had the foresight to be thinking of this beforehand and to be coming here to talk to us about this and to help give us input as to how this needs to be done. In contrast to the provinces, which have reported in the press that they will have trouble meeting our timeline, we invited all of them. All but Saskatchewan declined to appear here, and of the only one that showed up, Saskatchewan said that it wasn't a priority for them at all, and they wouldn't be doing anything on this except for the fact that we have a timeline on them and that they have to deal with it. So in contrast to what we've seen in the input from the provinces, I thank you for, as I say, your foresight in thinking about this beforehand and coming here today. Now, as for the costs, I was going to quote some of the figures, but you already talked about that as to what we have committed to help with law enforcement and training, because we do understand that there's going to be costs to this borne by law enforcement and provinces and municipalities, which is why we've committed to. And I keep having to look at these numbers because I can never commit them to memory, but it's 274 for law enforcement and border efforts, and another 161 million for the training of frontline officers in recognizing impaired driving, because we know that this is going to stretch your resources without this. There's going to be other costs as well, but right now, as the system goes, we have people who are being arrested, charged in courts. We know that's expensive. We know that's costing a lot of money. I'll start with you, Ms. Holmes. Would you not agree that that money is going to be saved to the system? Is that not going to be a substantial saving to our system when we're no longer arresting people for simple and charging them for simple possession?
Well, to be honest, I don't particularly see myself as an expert in the number of cases that would be before a criminal court in Alberta. So I can't say whether or not there would be a significant cost. I just know that in the concern that we have addressed the fact that we think that there will be costs when it comes to enforcement in regards to training and equipment. But beyond that, there will be additional costs as well. And I mean, an example I can give the committee is in smaller municipalities. They have a completely different capacity to be able to absorb these type of legislative changes than in a large city. So in that case, we're going to need to have training for even just municipal councillors on how to create the bylaws that they're going to have to put into place in order to have this happen. So there is cost beyond just enforcement. But that being said, I would anticipate there would be savings. I just can't answer appropriately for whether or not what the amount would be.
Certainly. Okay. And from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see... Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. A little delay here. We apologize for that. Much rather be in Ottawa there with you, but can't pull that off today. So our position is that legalization simply will not reduce the workload of our local police services. In fact, with the different issues coming forward, we'll expand them. So to break down what savings there may be, that work really hasn't been done. But overall, we believe that there will be significant costs associated with enforcing all the new rules, such as impaired driving, personal cultivation, possession limits, providing cannabis to minors, those type of issues. So, you know, at the end of the day, we do believe that there's significant cost increases.
So you don't think there's going to be... but you say it's going to increase the workload despite the fact that officers are not going to be arresting for simple possession?
We really do truly believe that based on the other issues that compound their workload.
What would be examples of the things that would increase their workload under this that would more than counterbalance the savings in workload from arresting people for possession?
So yes, thank you for that. And you know, we have given considerable thought to that. Certainly the impaired driving issue and the testing that needs to be done when it comes to capital costs, equipment that may need to be bought. We certainly do recognize that the federal government has contributed some money, and that's appreciated. But really, we don't believe that that's going to cover all those costs.
Okay, yeah, and that's understandable. Now, another question regarding, again, let's talk about impaired driving. We do know that impaired driving due to cannabis right now is an issue. It's
to add some information when you're finished about impaired driving.
Okay,
I
want to finish this line of questioning first. We have some issue. You know, we do know it's an issue, and we know it's out there. Right now, we don't have the tools to deal with it, despite the fact that we know it's widespread, and we don't even quite know the extent of it. Would this not be an advantage to your law enforcement officials and to your municipalities that we are now introducing a way to deal with a problem that we haven't really been equipped to deal with up to now? I'll start with you.
So the way that I look at it when it comes to impaired driving is, yes, we do have an issue with it now, but as right now, the average person considers that cannabis is illegal. So when we have it legalized, then I think the public education campaign in regards to looking at impaired driving is going to be key, because there will be an increase, there's no question. And the concern that we have is that we are not confident that there is going to be technology in place on July 1st that will be able to implement into our local police detachments to be able to deal with this. And to give an example, like you were saying about the increase in workload, from what I have been told by RCMP officials in Alberta, an example of how it would impact Morinville is if someone was pulled over suspected of being impaired on cannabis by a community peace officer who is able to enforce traffic law, they would then have to call the RCMP in to be able to take that person to a hospital to get a blood test to determine whether or not they are, because as of right now, we don't have technology in place to do any sort of roadside screening. So there would be a workload of having an RCMP officer, of which I only have 9 in a municipality of 10,000, that would have to go and sit in a hospital in a different municipality waiting to find out whether or not the person is impaired. That's as far as I understand it. So there is a significant concern that I have over the increase that we're going to see in impaired driving, the lack of education around it in the public, and then the idea that I don't have information that I've received that we have proper enforcement tools available.
You won't see an increase in impaired driving because of cannabis.
Time's up, but Ms. Emery, you wanted to make a comment?
I understand driving and cannabis is a major issue and a concern, and I am not advocating impaired driving. But the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration of the United States released a report in 2015 that called Drug and Alcohol Crash Risk and did not find an increase in crash risk associated with THC. And even more recently, the American Journal of Public Health, as we are here at the Health Committee, in 2017, July, very recent, please look this up, that changes in motor vehicle crash fatality rates for Washington and Colorado were not statistically different from those in similar states without recreational marijuana legalization. And we do know that police, this is recent studies, so please do look this up. And I'm not encouraging impaired driving, but the vast majority of cannabis consumers are not driving impaired. Their judgment is not impaired like with alcohol. With alcohol, you think you can drive and you know you can't. With cannabis, you know when you can't and you won't drive. But we also have to consider the hundreds of thousands of medical marijuana patients in this country who are unable to drive or contribute or work if they don't use cannabis. So if you criminalize those who drive under the influence of cannabis, you're going to criminalize every patient and poor medical user across this country. What we're also finding is that this targeted harassment, as we've admitted, would require taking someone to a hospital, using a needle, drawing their blood against their will when they don't get to give consent. And for what? To prove that they've consumed cannabis or to prove that they're impaired? Because impairment is proven by performance. Whether you're driving behind the wheel on pharmaceutical drugs that say do not operate heavy machinery or vehicles while using these pills, whether you're angry because you had a fight, or whether you're texting. Texting is proven to increase crashes. We know it. It happened immediately. You can immediately say, cell phones and texting create distracted driving, create increased crashes on the road. It's demonstrable, it's proven. Cannabis, you can't prove it. And that's why the police and law enforcement are falling all over trying to figure out how do we find a test? How do we set a blood limit? And as an official endorser of Washington State's Initiative 502 campaign, I was part of the legalization along with my husband's prosecutor, so you can find common ground with people who worked against you before. But they admitted that they only had a blood level for cannabis because doing so would encourage the public to support that initiative. What we have to acknowledge is that decades of prohibition and misinformation generated by the government and fear about driving cannabis is actually discouraging people from finding out the truth about cannabis. And as I said, American Journal of Public Health 2017 studied this extensively. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Cannabis is not a crisis for the roads. Police should be focusing on alcohol and truly dangerous drugs.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Of course, that's contrary to testimony that we heard from Washington, where impaired drug driving increased from 8% to 17% when they legalized. Colorado, that saw a 32% increase, and the increase overall in the U.S. in fatalities due to drug driving. However, my question is for Ms. Holmes. I thought you very nicely pointed out the difficulty in the rushing that's happening with this legislation. With only 288 days left before the government wants to legalize marijuana, we actually have to finish updating C45, and then the provinces have to come with their legislation that chooses in the areas that we've given flexibility what they're going to do, and then municipalities have to decide how they're going to implement that, all without any funding in all the areas that you've talked about. So the first and most important thing that we heard was public education has to come to parents and youth as well as to society about the hazards of impaired drug driving. And I wondered how much public education has the federal government provided to your municipality, and how much funding for this initiative have they provided?
At this point, specifically to the town of Morinville, we have not received public education funds or any sort of tools. That being said, I know AUMA has been working hard at developing toolkits, and so has the FCM, in order to support municipalities in these areas, as we feel like it is also a local issue as much as it is a federal one.
Thank you. Now, my question is for Bill Karsten with respect to home grow. We heard testimony that there's a lot of concern with home grow. Some of the issues mentioned are 24 times more likely to have fires, issues with mold, electricity stealing, and one issue that was raised where it was an issue of people that are property owners in Ontario or Quebec, where you would not be able to prevent somebody that was renting from you from growing cannabis or smoking or consuming cannabis on your premises. Is this a similar concern to the ones you were indicating?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So personal cultivation is an area that could have many new implications for municipalities across the country, and those need to be properly understood. At this point, it's not clear how this aspect of legislation will be managed, but we foresee municipalities having to respond to health and safety, and as well as you alluded to, nuisance type of concerns. So the message that I'd like to go back to, and that's much like on the other question, I don't think necessarily this should be a debate about, the impaired driving, or in fact, determining all of these things at the committee level. I believe that what we need to send as an organization of municipalities from coast to coast is the message that we need to be involved. We will only know how to tackle these problems, even though we've started. FCM is proud, as I've said, to send out a primer to all of our members, and a guidebook or guideline will be coming out. But we need to be involved with the federal government and understand we do deal on a national level with the federal government now. We've had several meetings and so on, our staff, but we need to be involved in the regulatory framework.
The other question I have has to do with treatment. We've heard a lot about how there's an expectation that, especially with youth, there's a 30% greater increase in schizophrenia, psychotic disorders, depression, and in fact that there are folks that are actually addicted to cannabis, and we need treatment for that. So how well are the municipalities across Canada set up to address the increase that's expected?
Thank you again so much for that question. Obviously, it's a very important question. We unfortunately are not the sector experts on that particular issue. I would hope that provincially, each province is looking through their public health folks and their health departments as to how to best deal with that. We really don't have the expertise here.
Same question.
So as it stands, the municipalities in Alberta are not responsible, in essence, for that type of issue because it is health related. That being said, every single issue is a local issue, and everything will rest and lie at our feet when it comes to the end of it. So we will have to work through our FCSS, our Family Community Support Services departments, in order to find some sort of tools to be able to work through this. But we'll just be offering to the province the same thing we're offering to you, is that we will work with them on anything that they need to make sure that they have the regulations in place in order for those things to be addressed.
Okay, and one more municipal question, then I'm going to turn to the Emerys. Do you municipalities feel that you have enough flexibility under C45 to choose where marijuana can be sold and consumed?
So I would certainly address it this way, that again, that's one of the issues that we have looked at, but not understanding what the retail model is going to be from province to province. This is where it becomes somewhat, again, important, and I don't like to sound truthfully like a worn out recording, but we need to have the information, we need to be involved. So being a councillor in Halifax, yes, we've started some of that work, but in fact some of that work we're doing is actually quite costly because we're doing work that we don't know if we're going to utilize or not. So crucially important for me to continue that theme, that We can be ready. We've said that from the offset, that we believe municipalities, we believe as Federation of Canadian Municipalities, that we can in fact be ready as willing and able partners.
Okay, I'm running out of time. Can I get an answer from Ms. Holmes on this one, on the flexibility?
Sure. As it stands right now, we again, as Bill was saying, we don't know the details around what we will be able to do. We're hoping, working with the province, that we will be able to establish some municipalities some autonomy in regards to where the facilities will be located, where production facilities will go. There is also the question that there's municipalities in Alberta that do not want to have either production or distribution facilities in their municipality.
Okay.
And so we're asking for that.
And to the Emerys, if C45 is passed in its current form, will you abide by this new law or continue in civil disobedience?
I'm choosing to follow the law as much as I can because I only engaged in opening up dispensaries last year in April, and that's what I'm currently charged with. I do face potentially life in prison as I sit here before you, which would certainly cost taxpayers a lot more. I do want to add that with municipalities, we should be looking at allowing the storefronts to operate similar to caffeine, which is an addictive stimulant drug that I can get for free right in the back of the room, or like alcohol. If I want to open a bar or a restaurant and provide alcohol, or a craft brewery, the municipal regulations and licensing shouldn't be that restrictive or prohibitive or even costly if done right.
Good.
Mr. Davies.
Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I want to just start by saying, you know, since the Ledane Commission in the early 70s, the issue of legalization of cannabis has been on the public policy agenda for decades, and I have no illusions that we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about a form of I'm going to call it decriminalization, not legalization, of cannabis without the work of many people who have sacrificed a lot. And I think you, Mr. Emery, and you, Ms. Emery, I can't think of any two people who are more important to hear from on this legislation than from you. I know you've dedicated your lives to this subject and at great personal cost and sacrifice, so I want to just make that comment. Ms. Emery, I want to start with you about just the broad scheme of the bill. You have described this bill as this is not legalization, it's prohibition 2.0. Can you please explain that?
Well, there are three reasons why Canadians came around to support legalization. Number one is that we shouldn't criminalize our fellow Canadians who are otherwise law-abiding. They should not be banned from traveling to the United States or lose their job for failing a drug test or have their kids taken away by Children's Aid. None of that criminalization or harm should happen to peaceful, nonviolent Canadians. Number two, this industry already exists. It's worth billions of dollars. The Fraser Institute and many others have analyzed it and said cannabis should be legal because it already exists. It's already being grown and sold and shared and consumed. It's in every movie and TV show. It's everywhere. It's normalized, except for with the government. So we should allow the existing industry to come out of the shadows and into the light. The third reason to legalize is that law enforcement has spent billions of dollars, billions of our tax dollars on going after people for pot. I'd much prefer that go towards healthcare or education or social housing or anything, or allowing our law enforcement to focus on serious crimes that have victims. But Bill C45, as it's presented, will not offer amnesty or pardons to people who have been convicted. It will not allow people like my husband and myself to be free from a criminal record. It will not allow the existing industry to transition into legality. In fact, it introduces tougher new penalties and prohibits those who have been victimized by prohibition from being allowed to transition. So we're being locked out from participating and locked up for being unable to participate. The third reason for marijuana legalization being law enforcement spending, well, Friday we saw an announcement of $250 million of additional tax dollars going towards marijuana law enforcement. Well, legalization is supposed to mean you no longer have to enforce a law against it. We know that marijuana law enforcement is extremely costly, and many police officers don't even want to enforce the law, which is why they often don't charge some people, but do charge others. And as Mr. Bill Blair, who is not with us right now, has admitted himself, marijuana prohibition and law enforcement targets people who are of color, the indigenous groups, the poor, the marginalized. So this bill will not legalize anything that we've been fighting for it.
Other witnesses have pointed out that the bill still contains a criminalized model where if you have more than 30 grams of possession in a public place, you can be subject to criminal sanction. If you have more than 4 plants over 100 centimeters, you can be arrested and serve time selling and other kinds of offenses. Mr. Emery, Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, is quoted as saying on getting it right, he said, quote, "We have to create an entire system that controls and regulates marijuana that will include medical marijuana and properly licensed dispensaries. Are we getting it right?
Oh, goodness, no. It's all wrong. And in fact, to answer your colleague's question, will I continue to break the law? Absolutely. Because the law, breaking the law is the only way the cannabis culture has gotten any kind of improvement in their status over the last 20 years. For example, this Parliament banned all books and magazines about marijuana in 1987. That law lasted 7 years until I and some colleagues started distributing books and magazines in front of police stations, and we finally got charged giving out pamphlets to high school students, and we went to Judge J. Ellen MacDonald in the Ontario Superior Court, and she struck that down. So then I started, distributing pamphlets and encouraging everybody to sell bongs and pipes, which were all illegal. And now we have a thriving industry across Canada. And I started selling seeds, which were illegal and probably still are illegal. And I sold millions of them to Americans and Canadians. So we could bypass this government, because the only way to really make pot legal, I thought, was if marijuana was everywhere and everybody had it, then the government would be helpless, which is really why we're here, because we won. We've accomplished that. Marijuana's everywhere. People are growing it. There's stores opening. We don't care if we go to jail. We don't care if you charge us. We're going to do our thing because we love cannabis and we're in the cannabis culture. So I'm going to continue to break these laws because it's terrible. It criminalizes everybody who is supposed to be legalized and then enriches the government monopolies that are being proposed and these wealthy stock market production companies who don't have any relationship to cannabis but just raise money on the stock market, somehow get hand in glove with the Liberal government, and now they're operating and selling marijuana even though people I know have been doing it 10, 20, 30 years are not going to be offered any such invitation.
I just want, because I'm really curious about your opinion on this. We've already heard Ontario, I think you mentioned Quebec and maybe possibly New Brunswick,
yes,
are moving to a government monopoly system, yes, that will clearly freeze out dispensaries. I'm just wondering what you think about that. I mean, will
well, they can't be. That won't be supportable. I will encourage everybody to boycott the government stores. We will physically try and stop people from going in. We're going to advise them that they're traitors if they go to the government shops, because these are the people that have oppressed us for 50 years. You're going to give your money to the very enemy that's beaten us, killed our animals when they raid us, rounded up our kids, took away our cash, took away our plants, took away our livelihoods. Are you kidding me? We can never let the government be the profiteers of marijuana after all the years that they've abused us, exploited us, and persecuted. It's pure sadism. This cannabis law is pure sadism, the one you're proposing and the one that we've had for 50 years. It's just punishing Canadians for no valid reason.
I moved to production because the task force said that decisions on production, distribution, and retail have clear implications for businesses hoping to enter the cannabis industry, including how to ensure a diversity of participants. It is apparent that there is significant interest and speculation about the potential for new revenues. Supply chain management has significant implications for consumers and communities. Price, product quality, and accessibility can all be affected depending on what route the government chooses to take. So they recommended use licensing and production controls to encourage a diverse, competitive market that also includes small producers. Do you see C45 accomplishing that recommendation?
Bill C45 accomplishes no objective whatsoever that is desirable. And the thing is, it's staring us all in the face. If we want the price to plummet where money's not even a factor with marijuana, if we want all Canadians to be treated fairly before the law, if we want to restore civil liberties, if we want to take away all that police power we've given the police for 30, 40 years to wiretap, to surveil, to pose as drug dealers, to do all this sort of stuff that's costing billions of dollars, then just take cannabis out of the schedule. Just remove it from the schedule. Tell everybody that otherwise you have to be law-abiding, peaceful, pay your taxes, pay your employees well, obey all municipal regulations, but basically just treat it like any other normal industry. After all, it hasn't killed anybody for 50 years. There isn't any other industry in this country that's like that. They all put out pollution that kills, or the cars that kill, or the foods that kill, or their drugs that kill, or their tobaccos that kill, their alcohol that kills. Heck, everything is killing Canadians except cannabis, and you want to treat it like it's plutonium. It's insane.
I'd like to add that with one of the major issues of C45 is that the federal government does control the production. Now, you've all heard of BC Bud. Cannabis has been growing all across this country for a very long time, and the provinces deserve and should have the power and the ability to license their own production agents themselves. If the provinces have to wait on the federal government to supply cannabis, the provincial government stores are going to not have any product on the shelf. We saw Nevada declared a state of emergency, asking for more pot growers to come forward because they sold out in 1 week. And we're seeing it happen all over the world. So you need a lot of supply. You need it everywhere. You need to allow municipalities to license their own craft growers and like craft breweries. You need to allow provinces to do it. And you need to allow the federal government to let it happen. But if the production is controlled federally, distribution provincially, storefronts and policing municipally, of course you've got a big disaster coming. But
only government could think of that plan. Only government. The marketplace would look at that and go in horror. That'll never work.
Also, I'd like to add that if you do allow the provinces the control over setting up pot monopolies, we could call it, instead of allowing Canadian citizens, innovators, entrepreneurs, small business owners, instead of allowing them to create jobs, create tax revenue, and give back to the community, you're going to force every taxpayer to subsidize a multi-hundred-million-dollar government bureaucracy that the government itself admits they will not be able to make money from. They're going to lose money. And again, they don't even know what the product is. Why can they not allow the people who have grown and sold and love this plant, why can't they allow us to come forward and come out of the shadows? Why do you continue to criminalize us?
What do you have against us for 50 years as the big thing?
Mr. McKinnon now. Thanks very much. Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, and thank you. I think we'll move to municipal issues for a while. Mayor Karsten, you spoke in terms of needing extensive implementation process, coordinating with all levels of government and so forth. Certainly that's been underway ever since this process began. I know that Parliamentary Secretary Blair has consulted across the country and both to provincial partners as well as municipal. So I think that is underway. Other things like prioritizing decision points, federal funding, and so forth are really out of the scope for what this committee is commissioned to do. Our job is to examine the Bill C45, which deals really with the treatment of marijuana in terms of whether it's legal or not. It doesn't deal with impairment issues. Impairment issues are dealt with in C46, which study is going to be underway soon. C46 does provide additional mechanism, additional tools for detecting and processing impairment situations. So, and I'd like to actually correct the record. Ms. Gledu said that in Colorado the impaired driving rate increased. We have a letter from the governor of Colorado to, and the Attorney General for Colorado to the Attorney General of the United States, saying that in the first 6 months of 2017, impairment actually decreased by 21%. And I take note of Ms. Emery's reference to the National Highway Safety Board, which indicates not a major increase, at least, in impairment offenses. So I would suggest that impairment is probably not the issue to talk about in respect to legalization. I guess I'm going to be more specific now. I mean, right now, I know in British Columbia we have situations where growers, illicit growers, will take over, will rent a property and turn it into a grow-op, which is not appropriate for the property, not appropriate for the landlord, and so grow-op, policing grow-op does become an issue. So I think that with this new legislation, that sort of thing will cease. So I would suggest to you that that's a case where this legislation will reduce the load on municipalities, and I would ask all three of you witnesses to, if you would like to testify to that or relation to that. Starting with Mayor Karsten, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. McKinnon. And I have to suggest right up front, thank you very much for the promotion. I'm a councillor in the city of Halifax, and Mayor Mike Savage, former member of Parliament, would not be pleased with me suggesting that I'm the mayor of Halifax. So
always another election.
Yeah, that's right. Touche. Sir, thank you for those comments. And you know, one thing about the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, we have great respect for the work that the federal government's doing on all the files, and I certainly wouldn't want to be combative in responding to your points. They're well taken. The issue, I think, in terms of when you suggest that, yes, we have talked and have had meetings with folks like Mr. Blair, etc., we view those more as preliminary consultations as opposed to the ability to really, truly sit down at the table and understand this as it evolves week by week by week. So that's still a message that we have in terms of needing to be at the table and involved all the time. Very interesting point that you make in terms of, yes, the variance between the two companion pieces of legislation, B46, B45, or C45 and C46. We will, in fact, be providing additional information on FCM's position in a forthcoming submission to the House of Justice Committee. So that will be specifically on C46.
Actually, Mayor Holmes, please.
I would concur with Councillor Carson's. I think that there is a significant difference between actually sitting at the table as a partner versus being asked for information as a stakeholder, which is what I consider municipalities are doing. In regards to our invitation here or the meetings we've had with Mr. Blair, we receive a lot of information at the meetings we have with different parliamentarians, but we don't actually get to have a conversation about what our ideas are and how we think things can move forward. Legislation is set, regulations are set, we offer our input through a survey or some sort of letter. So we're really asking for a different model. We're asking for the opportunity to sit at the table and tell you about the concerns that we have, and that's not just with the federal government, it's with the province as well. In Alberta, they've created the Cannabis Secretariat, which is a group of administration from the different ministries, but again, we are just asked to come and present to them what our concerns are. There's no dialogue back and forth. So that's where I think that the issue was. In regards to building code safety, we definitely are advocating to the province of Alberta that they make significant changes, and that will allow us, once they've done that, to change the bylaws that we have to be able to enforce those changes. So it's just part of that.
I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that we need to get this legislation done as correct as we can make it, so that we have a defined terrain from which to proceed for defining building code changes, for defining provincial regulations, for working out the retail model, which will be a provincial responsibility as well. Mm-hmm. So, but until we get this right, or as right as we can get it, we all this stuff kind of hangs in the balance, right? So.
I have a good solution. Our Canadian farmers currently grow cannabis on thousands and thousands of acres in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, and it's just, they use it for seeds, but it's the same plant, it's marijuana. They can grow this marijuana. They can grow marijuana that would sell in our stores, or any stores, for $20,000 a metric ton. That's 2 cents a gram. So it could be sold for $1 or $2 a gram at a tremendous profit to all our farmers across the prairies who have enormous amounts of land that can be used to grow marijuana. At that point, no one would grow it in their home. Growing in your home is expensive. It requires electricity. It's an unnecessary use of urban space. Essentially, if you just legalize marijuana the way you're supposed to, let anybody grow it who's in a position to grow it on an economy of scale, the price will plummet. No one will grow in their home anymore. None of us would. I'm looking for the day when legalization takes all the money out of marijuana. That's so common.
Thank you. I'd like to hear from Mayor Holmes, please.
I know one concern, of course, is grow-ops in houses. Now,
pardon me? I'd like to hear from Mayor Holmes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you put me.
So I believe what the concern that I've got in regards to this is the information, yes, it does need to be brought forward to this committee and you need to make decisions. And then the province will make their decisions and municipalities will make their decisions. What we're saying is that things are done in a silo, that the province is not here. They're not discussing these changes with you. So Alberta specifically, because that's why I'm here, will have to come at some point and take what you've done and interpret it in whatever's going to happen to them. And then there's going to be things specifically to Alberta we're going to have to deal with at the municipal level. So the ask that we have is that we have those conversations together, that we try to get everything in place before July. And the way that it's working right now and the timing, we don't anticipate that will happen. The conversations will happen here. The province will get around to getting it done when they can, and then it'll become July July, and we won't have anything ready at the municipal level.
Well, we did invite them, so.
Time's up, Mr. McKinnon. Thanks very much. Now, that completes our first round of 7-minute questions. Now we're going to go to the second round with 5-minute questions, starting with Dr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and again, thanks to all our witnesses. This has been a great panel. I guess I'm looking at 288 days, and you know, this started out as an election promise, and I think it was very poorly thought out. At the end of the day, I think all the witnesses, you know, they want to look after the health and safety of Canadians, particularly our kids. We've heard from other jurisdictions, and what I'm really seeing is a disconnect here. In the United States, with Colorado and Oregon, it seems it was the people up. It was you know, referendums and moved up through the process. Here we've got a government that wants to do top down. And Mayor Holmes, we've heard that a lot. In other words, the municipality or the jurisdictions that have done this are telling us quite clearly, before you do this, okay, make sure you have public education in place, data collection, you've got research and development, treatment prevention, workplace safety, all of these things in place. And it seems that the government doesn't realize a lot of that stuff they're downloading to the provinces, the territories, the municipalities, and Indigenous people without giving them the back and forth, like you were saying, to be a partner at the table. So the federal government doesn't even have its law in place, and now they're expecting everybody, the status quo on the ground, to adapt, and everybody just to fall in line, and we're going to be happy July 1st, we'll get this all figured out. So I was wondering, like, are there any programs that municipalities can actually go to the government? They made these announcements, and they're great at announcements, but is there any practical things that you can work with? Because the cost of this, I can't even imagine what it's going to be costing you guys. But for these things, public education, data collection, are there any programs you can actually get funds and help from the federal government to implement what you need to have implemented in just 288 days?
As far as I know, no. That the thing that we're most concerned about is the enforcement side, and then there is not the ability for us to have funding except for what was announced last week. So there's concerns in regards to public education, absolutely. Also, just like I said, capacity for staff, people to understand that are making the decisions, what the impact will be. And there is also, there's a general just discussion on the fact that this is an interesting topic, but it's actually not the #1 priority of municipalities in Alberta. Right. But it's the #1 thing I talk about, because I think people have the most misinformation about this. They just don't understand what they're going to deal with, and they're scared that this deadline's looming, and they're not going to have their communities and their citizens protected in time.
Well, even if you look at some of the science out there, I think it was Mrs. Emery brought about these, is it per se limits or something, if they'll even hold up in court. Now, you say you have 9 RCMP officers, and my understanding is they have officers called designated, what is it, DREs? I forget what it stands for, recognition experts, that have been seen by the Supreme Court. And these are trained officers that deal with impairment. So whether you're impaired on alcohol or cannabis or prescription drugs or glue or gasoline, that seems to be the issue. But there's no money put forward. They've announced it. But to have these officers on the ground, because we don't even know if these blood levels, what they mean, or if they're ever going to do anything. What do you foresee the costing for your officers and the training that needs to be done on the ground? Do you see a time limit that you could actually get these things in place that we need to do before this rolls out to protect the health and safety of Canadians?
The concern that I have is that I'm not sure that the technology exists. I haven't been told whether or not it is there. And if it does, then that's fine. Then we need to have the technology purchased and rolled out into each municipality along with the training. We were assured at a meeting with Mr. Blair that the training is being brought forward from the United States and adapted to Canadian needs, and then will be presented to the RCMP. What I have been advocating for, though, here is that we need to make sure that that extends into all levels of enforcement in a municipality, and ensure that every single person that will be discussing or having a conversation with someone they believe is impaired will be trained to do it respectfully, and that we won't be in a circumstance where someone will be pulled off the street by someone who doesn't understand what the changes are.
Well, I wanted to thank you very much for that. Ask Mr. Emery, the way that they're rolling this out, like I've heard from some people that say this is actually going to make things worse. And we've been hearing from a lot of people, if they're going to go down this route, to slow down, make sure you're not going to make things worse, that this is going to be doable for the provinces and territories and people on the ground that are distributing marijuana, the medical marijuana market, things like that. Do you think there's any room for decriminalization? Like if we started right away and just said, okay, look, let's breathe for a moment. Let's decriminalize it, a certain amount, maybe make it a ticketable offense for now or whatever the comfort. Is there any room for anything like that?
Our objective is that there should be no punishment of any kind for the use of cannabis, any more than there is for responsible use of alcohol or a home brew in your own home. I can own a vineyard. With my criminal record, I can't seemingly be able to get a license to produce marijuana, but I can still go out and start my own brewery. I can still start my own vineyard. I can do a lot of things with alcohol, tobacco, and a number of harmful substances that I'm now going to be not permitted under this law to participate in the marijuana industry. One thing you did mention was public education. I sure hope a public education campaign is not going to be done by the same government that lied to the Canadian public for 50 years and demonized us to make people fear us when there was nothing to fear about cannabis users or cannabis growers. And if it were legal, we wouldn't be growing in homes or in facilities we've rented from other people. It'd be grown out on our Canadian farms, and we'd let our Canadian farmers grow it and supply it. Soon CBD is going to be in everything you buy. It's going to be in your yogurt, your milk, because it's non-psychoactive and it's a cannabinoid product that's just immeasurably valuable to everybody. It's anti-anxiety, and everybody's stressed out and anxious, and it calms you, and it soothes the body, and it's not psychoactive. It's an aspect of marijuana that if you took it every day, your life would be greatly improved, and you're going to see it industrialized in our foods. Like anything you consume daily, eventually is going to have CBD. So we're going to see an enormous amount of innovation, but we need to free the market properly in order for all this to happen. Let our farmers grow it. Let them extract it. Let us put it in our foods, the CBD. And you won't be growing in homes anymore. Very few people will be smoking it after about 10, 20 years because much more sophisticated techniques are going to come along so people can benefit.
Time's up. And now we go to His Worship Mayor Ayoub.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask the question in French, so if you want to take the hearings, please.
Clearly, as a former mayor, I'd like to say hi to my colleagues. We don't forget our roots. But in my situation, I've learned that using cannabis in my region involves 45% of young people aged 15 to 24. I'm from a region north of Montreal, and the percentage of users is 35% for this age group. We also need to have objectives, and we have to meet them to make sure we can address urgent situations. I'm not looking at the advantages or the dangers of marijuana, as there are many. There's a whole range of topics involved in that. But what many people have said is that for kids up to 25 years of age, it's dangerous to use marijuana. And that's exactly why we have regulation coming for legalization. It's to stop young people from using marijuana as much as possible. And they are using it right now from people who produce marijuana, and we don't know what's in it. Organized crime often provides most of this product. So my colleagues, other mayors, when citizens and parents come to see you and they tell you half of my family might be smoking marijuana and I have no way of controlling this situation, do you feel there's a sense of urgency when someone asks you that? I'd like to know your opinion on that, Ms. Mayor.
Holmes, you're...
So I agree with you, and I actually have to say that it doesn't take someone coming to talk to me about that. It doesn't require a parent. I'm the mother of a 13-year-old boy, and so I am very clearly aware of what the concerns are, and that's why I'm imploring you to get it right, because I know that, yes, there are people in circumstances, and we've heard about it from the Emerys, about some of the people that are going through struggles in regards to what the current legislation is and how this is being done. But that being said, we need to make sure that we're not rushing into something that's going to create more problems, that's going to cause issues with people feeling comfortable in their communities. And that being said, it's not just the users, but it's also the people that live there, that may be renting a home to someone who's going to be growing marijuana, or will be living in a circumstance where they feel like they're just not comfortable around other people that are using it. And that is the case. So I do agree that there is a level of urgency, but I also believe that there is time to be able for us to have conversations about what we all need in this process.
Mr. Carson, or if you want to, do you have an answer for that? Any preoccupation for that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So, you know, I think Ms. Holmes answered my sentiments well. In my case, it's more about getting it right for my 3 granddaughters, because anything I try to do at the municipal level, I actually do frame it on the basis of this is all about the future. So, you know, we at FCM still are in a position, we've said this from the offset, that the actual legalization of cannabis is in fact a federal decision, and as you know, was something that was committed to in 2015. So we and the municipal sector feel that we are still committed to ensuring that it is implemented as long as we can be involved, and that it's done in a safe and effective way.
There are several people who've said this. In Colorado, for example, there was a case, and also in Washington. Do you think that overnight marijuana legalization will mean that most drivers on the road will have marijuana in their bloodstream? Will most people start growing marijuana in their apartments? Will most people start using marijuana because it's legal all of a sudden? Personally, I'm not a scientist, but I don't think so. There's alcohol, there's cigarettes, there's all sorts of other legal products that also can harm people, and people are aware of this, and they don't necessarily use them. So I don't think that the world's going to end as when marijuana is legalized. There'll be an before and there'll be an after, and the sky's not going to fall. So we need infrastructure. So that's what we're trying to establish, and we're going to consult as many people as possible. And your government does consult people. We haven't seen this over the past 10 years before it came into power. So what we want to look at is the security of our young people. And that's what I want to add, Mr. Chair. I have no questions.
With teenage use, the Journal of Adolescent Health 2017 reported that teens do not experience an increase in psychotic symptoms with cannabis alone. It happens when they use tobacco or alcohol along with cannabis is when they can aggravate the symptoms, and it's a very small percentage of people already predisposed who might be aggravated. The British Association of Psychopharmacology in 2016 said there's no IQ loss in teenagers, that even long-term chronic users of marijuana do not suffer any decrease in IQ, and we can see over history the increase in use of marijuana, but schizophrenia rates do not go up, IQ rates do not go down, and as I said, American Psychological Association in 2015 said that even chronic users, teenage users, don't have any further health problems later on in life. As for growing in the home, again, I'd like to touch on that since this is municipalities. The reason people are growing in houses is because it's valuable. That's risk and reward. So the more you prohibit or over-regulate something, people are going to try and get around that, or it will increase the value. So with growing in houses, however, in February of last year, federal court judge, Justice Michael Phelan, did analyze growing inside the home and found that despite the testimony of Len Garris and other law enforcement officials, that cannabis growing in the home can be done safely, and in most cases is done safely, and that's why he offered a federal injunction to provide the permission to patients to grow cannabis in their home. And I came into this building, there's a giant green wall with plants on it. That's a hydroponic system. That's an indoor growing operation right here in this very building, but it's done safely. The vast majority of consumers and growers and even sellers of cannabis do not want moldy bud. They do not want bad conditions in the home. The worst case scenarios that you find with grow ops that have damage and destruction are not patients, they're not advocates, they're profiteers. And the only reason those profiteers are even involved in the growing and selling of cannabis is because when government overregulates it and criminalizes it, it increases the penalties, it increases the reward. So just make it extremely cheap, extremely available. Organized crime is not going out there selling you sugar because it's available everywhere. And if we had cannabis just as available, you take away the profit motive from organized crime, and they'll have to find some other job to do.
Mr. Karsten.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to respond. So, Mr. Mayor, I appreciate your question, and I concur, and I believe that's pretty much evidenced by what the parliamentary budget officer suggests. I don't think everyone's just going to go in a car and smoke marijuana. I agree with you, sir. And the budget officer warns, in fact, as alluded to earlier, that revenues from cannabis sales may start out small. But I do want to suggest, as I alluded to, that again, when it comes to local governments, we will still face the significant administration and enforcement costs. And I'd just like to give you, if I may, in 30 seconds or less, the fact that in Colorado, municipal governments collected sales tax directly on cannabis, and these are the kind of conversations that we need to have. You know, it's just not right to roll it out and then come back to the municipalities and say, this is the way it's going to be without us being involved. So they receive an additional 15% on the state's marijuana tax cash fund. So there are other examples like Washington State, but the point being that the costs to municipalities, regardless of how the sales or retail end evolves, are going to be relatively large up front, and that's what we want to have the conversation about. Thank you.
Thanks.
May I just add one thought?
Yeah.
We have to make sure we understand that we're talking about two things when we talk about costs. We're talking about the startup costs. So all the work that needs to be done to prepare for the arrival of this legislation, to prepare for the policing, prepare for all the things, bylaws, etc. Then there's the ongoing administrative costs that will just continue on in perpetuity as the law is implemented. So we just have to make sure we're not losing sight of those two different kinds of costs that are going to be incurred by the municipalities. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. We have to move along now to Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be sharing my time with Dr. Carey. I'm just going to follow up on your comments from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities with respect to the smart revenue sharing model. So I agree that if municipalities have to bear a lot of the cost of putting this system in place, there should be something in C45 that would actually make it clear how that's going to be split. Do you have a recommendation, or would you like to see a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 between municipal, provincial, and federal, or what would you recommend?
May I go first?
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, great. Thank you. I didn't catch that part. So at this point, we've not had enough conversations, quite frankly, again, on the potential taxation models to prefer a specific model. So I think you know where I'm going with this, that even though there's not a specific model in mind, we are asking that support be provided to municipalities for the ongoing costs of legalization through some sort of revenue sharing model. Determining how to tax and what form this revenue sharing takes is one of the many issues that, quite frankly, does require further discussion. This is why FCM continues to call on the federal government through those consultations that we have to engage all orders of government. Simply put, you've heard that message, I think, certainly from Ms. Holmes now and ourselves, that where implementation cannot proceed locally without further direction from not only federal, provincial, territorial partners, but also the municipalities.
Yes, it doesn't sound like it's going to happen in 288 days. Anyway, the other thing I want to follow up on was you made a comment about how some municipalities may want to prohibit cannabis sales. And I just wanted to make you aware that we had testimony from Justice that said if at the federal level it's legalized, that will then make it impossible for any municipality to ban it in their municipality, because that would be a violation of everybody's rights and it wouldn't survive a court challenge. So I just wanted to put that out there for you. I'm going to turn it over at this point to Dr. Carey.
Thank you very much. I had some questions in regards to the border issue and trade. We're undergoing negotiations with our biggest trading partner, the Americans, with NAFTA, but there's a concern that I've heard being out of sync with our greatest trading partners. And I was wondering if you thought that it should be made a priority that we should be explaining what we're doing in this regard, because if right now the Americans, if they just ask you, they can stop you from going into the U.S. And this trading issue is all about jobs and the economy. I was wondering if that affects the municipalities, and then maybe also Mr. Emery, that I think you're quite aware they're very high-profile Canadians who have admitted to smoking marijuana, have no problem going back and forth to the U.S., but how does that make you feel?
Well, that's unusual. Most people, if a border official does a Google search and finds that you've got any relationship with marijuana, they're likely to bar you from entering, at least at that time, and up to 30 days, and possibly permanently. There are lots of examples of Canadians now permanently barred who were, in fact, the former mayor of Grand Forks, Brian Taylor, found himself barred from going back there. He used to go over there to buy milk and eggs, amazingly. I don't know why that's reasonable, but it's so close to the Grand Forks that he used to go and buy his. Now he's barred from doing so because he's had a relationship with marijuana. He's advocated as mayor. I will tell you this, though. The border states of Washington, Vermont, Maine, New York, Wisconsin, and Minnesota all have medical marijuana or legalization regimes. So the entire border, with the exception of Idaho and Montana and Pennsylvania, which is not so much on a border but across the lake, they're the only 3 states left that don't have some kind of medical or legal regime going on in the United States. So this argument that we're going to have a trade problem is diminished. What we're going to have is a border problem. One of the things they haven't thought of with the Ontario monopoly is that every single employee who works for the Ontario Cannabis Control Board is going to be barred from entering the United States. So as long as part of their employment they're willing to admit they're never going to the United States again, then that's fine. I'm sure they'll get employees. We in the free market already acknowledge this, that we're not going to be able to travel to the United States if we have a relationship with cannabis that's in any way public. So I suspect every government employee who wants to work for a marijuana shop might want to consider if they have family in the United States or if they ever go to the United States, because they're going to be barred.
Mayor Holmes, do you think this should be a priority issue discussed maybe between our Prime Minister and the American President about how this will affect our border? Because I'm hearing from Canadians who are worried. There's a lot of snowbirds go down their own property in the States, and they're worried even inadvertently if they have a cookie or something at a party when it's legal. If they get stopped, if there's a swab or a random test that the Americans are doing, this could be a big issue. And are there any concerns municipally?
It's not an area of space that I have any knowledge aside from watching the TV show Border Security. So I think Mr. Carson's might have more.
Had any other comments from?
Time's up. And we have to go to. Oh, I'm sorry. Did Mr. Carson
finish?
I was just going. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say maybe the mayor has a little too much time on her hands to be watching that show, but that's okay. So we don't really have a position on that either. Mr. Carey, I appreciate the question. What I would say in response, because we're talking U.S. versus Canada, I got to get this in, that every model and every state that's been researched by our policy folks have a specific carve-out or designated fund for municipalities. I had to slip that in. Thank you.
You did. Okay, we're going to go to Mrs. Sidhu now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sharing my time with John. This bill enables revenue sharing with provinces and territories. However, the legislation is going to be a finance issue. My question is to FCM. How is smoking, tobacco, drinking alcohol presently regulated for apartment building? What would the process be to add cannabis smoke to tobacco restrictions?
I'm pleased to jump in. So this is not really necessarily based on, I believe, policy work that FCM has done, but I can speak for my municipality and being councillor for now into my 4th term, that it would take a complete workup by staff on a bylaw, some of which potentially could evolve the public hearing process, that sort of thing. So it's a matter of knowing again what's allowed through the regulatory framework that would enable us to go forward with that.
And in your document, cannabis legalization, how can municipalities get ready? You suggested municipality consultation as a way to get ready. Do you know how many municipalities have taken that advice?
Don't have the number here today. We can certainly try to get it passed on to the chair and your committee for next week. We do know, and I know that's an abstract, there have been many members, many communities, many municipalities.
Okay, thank you. Pass it over, John.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing the time. Thank you for your comments and testimony today. I just wanted to say before we, I did want in the last few minutes of our week-long session on this to thank the clerk and his staff. I was doing some research to see how many witnesses have come to speak to an act before. The Fair Elections Act had 74, C51, the Anti-Terrorism Act, had 75, C2, an act to amend controlled drugs and substances, had 20, and after that it's lower numbers. So I think we might have hit the benchmark with over 100 witnesses on this particular topic, which speaks to the importance of it to Canadians and the social change that's coming with it. And I guess my last question, or so the question I would ask, or more of a comment and reaction to comment for the Emerys and for others that have been part of this very strong culture in trying to create change. The purpose of the Act is to prevent young persons from accessing cannabis, to protect public health and public safety by establishing stricter product safety and product quality requirements, and to deter criminal activity by imposing serious criminal penalties. The goal of the Act, so if you read that, it isn't about recreational marijuana users and optimizing their experience and optimizing their choices. It's a very different lens. And I think that's the social difference, or maybe the philosophical difference. So I understand and hear your frustration. I hear the background that you're coming from, but the Act addresses different social agendas than the one you've been speaking to.
Well, then it's inadequate. It's simply, but here's the thing. What's also important is there's no apology. The government has to admit that this policy's been wrong for 50 years, that demonizing, persecuting, arresting, and charging 2.4 million Canadians was wrong-headed. It was counterproductive, didn't do anything good for anybody except the police, who benefit by all these things. One thing I would like to point out, you're only a youth at age 15, 16, 17 for 3 years, and then for another 70 years on average, you're an adult. From age 18 to 85, which is the average length of life in this country now, you're an adult. So you shouldn't be writing laws for the 3 years prior to becoming an adult for 70 years. You should be writing the law for the adults. Autonomous adults who can get themselves abortions, who can fill themselves with alcohol. I can buy all the alcohol I want, fill my house. I can do a lot of things that are very, very dangerous, and this government and this society, a free democratic society, allows me to do that, and that's great, because most people handle responsibility well when given to them. But in this act, it's the opposite. It's like we're children, we're being condescended to constantly, told absurd, ridiculous things like your plant can't be higher than this. Who can control nature like that? These are plants, they grow. Right? They're going to be all sorts of sizes and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Everything in the legislation is inadequate.
I hear your reaction, but I just wanted to make sure that we clearly understood the intent.
Well, you said you were going to legalize. You didn't say this was a halfway measure to get somewhere. This was promised as a legalization by the Prime Minister at the last election.
For the municipalities, is there any final, like, I've heard a couple of areas of concern. A lot of the issues that you raised are with the provincial legislation yet to come. We're really dealing with some fairly limited blunt tools at the federal level. Are there any last words you would give to the committee as we're wrapping up this week that would facilitate your ability to prepare now based on the federal? I mean, you've got drafts of the Federal Act in front of you. To the extent they impact municipalities, you got a pretty good read of what's coming at the federal level. Is there, that's why I'm a bit, I understand you have a lot of detail yet for the provinces that you need to distill and understand, but is there any last federal direction that you're looking for clarity on, or areas that you're concerned about, other than the timing?
Is that for Lisa?
Yes. It's for you, Lisa, and for yourself, sir.
Okay. So, Lisa, do you want to go first? I can't see you.
Sure, that's fine. Thank you, Bill. So in regards to the ask, I guess, is I would like it to include a municipal revenue source in order for us to be able to cover the costs that we're going to incur for this. And I think that that's a really strong point that's been made by FCM over and over again. As well, I like some assurances that we're going to be able to get the training in place and that that's going to happen and it's going to be covered through all different municipal police type of enforcement services. And then I would also, I would ask that you implore the province that we sit down and have a conversation about what it looks like in a year, in 5 years, so that we're able to sit and say the outcome of this is what, and how can we all work together to get there.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for that question. Just in response to Lisa's comments, I would piggyback on that and say that, sure, let's have a continuous conversation over the next 5 years, but we do need to start as well to have a dialogue and conversation immediately. I don't want to repeat a lot that I've said, but certainly we have said all along that we want to engage as partners, and we can do the job of giving the tools and information resources to act now. So I just want to leave to be hopefully at the end of the day, and hopefully you folks are going to get your chance to hop on flights soon and head back to your respective hometowns. But I want to leave you this hopefully very valid and strong point that there are many examples and data that we can draw on from our neighbors in the south, and the Denver model, a municipality with just under 700,000, the costs associated with public health, education, enforcement totaled $7 million at the startup. Those projected numbers from 2016 for one municipality were about $9 million. So that is the plea for us to be engaged with you as a national organization on an ongoing basis immediately, and please consider startup costs and the ongoing model to provide municipalities the funds they need.
Thank you very much.
We have to move along now to Mr. Davies for the last question of the week.
Ms. Emery, I want to address this question to you as someone who's operated a dispensary. Prime Minister Trudeau also said this: the challenge of getting this important initiative right is one of ensuring we are broadly listening to partners, to folks in the medical marijuana industry, to municipal partners, to provinces, and drawing from best practices from around the world. We're going to get this right in a way that suits Canadians broadly. Now, I want to ask you a question about edibles and concentrates and other products that C45 will continue to make illegal. We've heard evidence before this committee that Colorado, Washington, Alaska have all legalized edibles. Colorado appears to have a very mature and thoughtful regulatory regime about those products. And here's what the task force said about edibles. In weighing the arguments for and against limitations on edibles, the majority of the task force concluded that allowing these products offers an opportunity to better address other health risks. Edible cannabis products offer the possibility of shifting consumers away from smoked cannabis and any associated lung-related harms. This is a benefit not just to the user, but to those around them. This position, they said that access to a broad range of cannabis products is possible via the illicit market, including through dispensaries and online retailers. So they recommend that the government regulate the production of cannabis and its derivatives, for example, edibles, concentrates, at the federal level, drawing on the good production practices of the current cannabis for medical purposes system, end quote. Do you see the omission of edibles in this bill and concentrates as a good or bad thing?
I think, well, I think the edibles, 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 I I think Canadians should have the free choice to consume cannabis however they would like, and I know that the Supreme Court of Canada sided with edible producers who literally made cookies and sold them in a dispensary. That's R.V. Smith, determining that cannabis patients do need access to oils, tinctures, extracts, hashish, whatever it may be. Edibles are extremely valuable, and we know that in Toronto, when the police cracked down last year, they really targeted edibles, and seniors are the ones who are hurt most. Elderly people, grandparents who come in and they're tired of these pills that they're on, they're tired of being unable to sleep, and all they know is that a couple bites of a cookie at night after dinner helps them feel better. No law should prohibit someone from having access to that. And if you'd like to see what branding and advertising and edibles look like, go to a cannabis event. Just follow my social media if you like, or check online, and you'll find that there are these marijuana events everywhere. There was an event called the Karma Cup that just happened. And you can see there are dozens and dozens of brands that are sophisticated. They've got logos, they've got products. They put a lot of time and effort into this, because the producers of edibles in this country are not shady dealers on the street corner trying to get kids to use pot. They're conscientious Canadian citizens who are trying to provide a much-needed service. Edibles have to be legal. I personally don't believe the federal government should be managing all these little details. I think cannabis should be removed from the CDSA and let everybody figure it out as they may. But edibles must be legal. They must be allowed.
Thank you. Mr. Emery, the task force also said this about e-commerce mail order. Consideration should be given to ensuring that online retail sales have appropriate consumer safeguards to accommodate those who may not have access to storefronts, for example, small communities, rural and remote locations, mobility-challenged individuals. A direct-to-consumer mail-order system for non-medical cannabis should be considered. You're probably aware that C45 does not contain a permanent national e-commerce platform. Is that a positive or negative thing in your opinion?
Well, a lot of these things depend on your interpretation. As representing the free market / black market, I would say that's more business for us if the government wants to neglect that area. But what we're really looking for in legalization is a reduction in the price over time, because something that's legal should be cheap. And right now, the price of marijuana is artificially high, and all the derivatives are way too high. People are spending far too much money on marijuana, and that's created a lot of the problems, is that it's attracted gangs, it's attracted criminals, it's attracting government. All I've heard from these fellows from the municipalities, how can we gouge the public for more money? We need more money. And somehow legalization is going to cost every single bureaucracy more than it did before. The cities are going to spend millions. The cops are going to spend millions more. You'd think we were doubling up on the criminalization, which we may well be doing, and that's why we have to spend all this money. Because it doesn't sound like legalization from anything I've heard from a municipality, from a provincial government, or from anybody here. It sounds like you're all into control and gouging as much money out of a vulnerable population of pot smokers as you can possibly get. And that, to me, is the real reason for this legislation. It's not to legalize pot. If it was legalized pot, Mr. Trudeau would say, Mr. Speaker, we have a majority. We've just removed cannabis from the schedule. My health minister will direct that, and from now on, the provinces are free to regulate. And that would be the whole legalization campaign. Instead, you've got 300 pages of a Cannabis Act that recriminalizes everybody, makes a huge bureaucracy of government at all levels, which we don't need, spends a lot more money, gives police more power. That sounds like prohibition.
Thanks. Mr. Speaker.
Time's up.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move my motion now, if I may. As I've given notice yesterday, I would like to move that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, this committee meet for an additional 2 days for the purpose of the consideration of Bill C45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts, and that the chair be empowered to coordinate the witnesses to a minimum of 32 witnesses, 8 per stakeholder group, the resources and scheduling necessary to complete this task in accordance with the following guidelines.
Let's excuse the witnesses. They've been here a long time. Then we'll continue on with your issue. Okay? Is that all right with you?
I got all the time in the world. Unemployed.
But we invited the witnesses to be here.
You said, Mr. Chair, that I was the last speaker, so whether they're sitting there or not doesn't seem to really matter. But
I just think we should thank the witnesses and for their contribution. They've all made a unique contribution, everyone. We value them all. They're very important testimony today. So on behalf of all the members of the committee, I want to thank you all for your contribution and your information. So with that, go ahead.
I'll just
free to
continue.
go now.
I'll continue reading where I was. 1, witnesses are to represent the following stakeholder groups in 4 2-hour panel blocks per day. 1, existing Canadian licensed producers and dispensaries. 2, producers of edible cannabis products and other non-smokable forms of cannabis. 3, ordinary Canadians who made a written submission to this committee regarding C45. And 4, young Canadians, 15 to 24 years old. Number 3, that witnesses for each panel block be allotted as follows: 2 Liberal, 1 Conservative, 1 NDP. 4, that witnesses be directed to prepare oral remarks for 10 minutes in length, and that the witnesses be invited to submit written statements prior to appearing. And 5, that the meetings be held prior to September 30, 2017. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to speak to my motion and give the rationale behind it. C45 is groundbreaking legislation in many respects. It changes a century of legal, social, economic, and cultural policy in this country. It's 131 pages long. It's 226 sections plus schedules. It deals with a number of complex issues about cannabis decriminalization. It involves cultivation, possession, age of access, health impacts, enforcement, production, packaging, labeling, international implications, edibles and concentrates, education, research, and other issues. Now, the Liberals proposed in June 5 days of hearing only to be conducted the week before Parliament resumed. They solicited the opinion of Canadians over the summer, when Canadians are probably least engaged in public policy. They have scheduled these hearings before Canadians could even be really fully engaged. In many respects, the hearings are over before most Canadians are really engaged in the hearings at present. By scheduling the entire week of hearing before the House of Commons, it avoids scrutiny in the House of Commons and restricts the ability of MPs to raise evidence that we hear in the House of Commons to question the ministers and government, as responsible government should allow us to do. It restricts the committee's ability to properly follow up on issues that arise from the testimony. And we've heard a lot of testimony this week that raises many issues that I think MPs on all sides of the table would like to be able to follow up on. Now, at that time in June, both the New Democrats and Conservative opposition objected to those 5 days. We said we need more days. And I want to pause to emphasize that this committee is the only phase of the legislative process where Parliament hears from the public, from stakeholders, from experts. It's the only opportunity for public input. And I believe that it's very important to hear those views as we do our job to study this bill. Now, at that time in June, when the opposition objected to the limitation of 5 days of hearing, the Liberals agreed. And they said that they were open to holding more hearing days if needed. Now today, after 5 days of hearing, it's obvious that there are glaring holes in this bill and that there are many issues that have been raised, and most importantly, that there has been an absence of critical voices. We have not yet heard a word from young people. We haven't had one witness aged 15 to 24. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we have heard from all sorts of people about how important it is that we get this cannabis legislation right for young Canadians, the health impacts on developing brains, how important it is that we talk to young people in a manner that they will accept and understand, how we're to be protecting the health of young Canadians, and yet we don't bother to listen to a single one to tell this committee about their access and how they feel about this issue. We haven't heard a word from ordinary Canadians, and there were many ordinary Canadians who wrote this committee with submissions and requested to appear. We didn't schedule one of them. Third, we haven't heard from any licensed producers themselves, the very people who have been growing legally cannabis in this country for the last 10 years. And fourth, we've heard a lot of evidence, and I think some exaggeration and maybe even some mythology about the impacts of edibles, but we haven't heard from a single edible and concentrate manufacturer or industry. Now, quite honestly, I think that these are glaring errors. Yet, for some reason, I believe that the Liberals do not want to hear from a single one of these groups. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, the New Democrats support legalization. We broadly support this bill. Frankly, we believe that this bill can be brought into force by next July, and we're willing to work with the government to do so. We want to work with the government to fix the holes that are in this bill that we've already identified. The absence of edibles and concentrates, the fact that there's a lack of a national e-commerce platform, the fact that this legislation does not deal with pardons, the fact that we have border issues and international considerations. There's all sorts of aspects to this bill that I think require further scrutiny. The fact that it still criminalizes many Canadians, including maintaining a maximum penalty of up to 14 years in prison for Canadians. So it is not the New Democrats' intention to be deleterious or to delay in any way the government's stated objective of hitting July 1. That's why in the context of my motion in the text, I said that we could hold those 2 days by September 30th. We know that the ministers are scheduled to appear next week on Tuesday, and we know at that process we're going to need at least after that we're going to need at least a week or two to prepare the many amendments before we start the clause-by-clause examination of this bill, where we're going to go through the entire bill line by line and discuss and debate and move amendments. We are into October no matter what. So I think it's eminently reasonable to say, let's schedule 2 more days of hearing to hear from those groups that are so important to hear from prior to September 30th, so that we can make sure that we have the broadest, most comprehensive evidence and information that we can get before this committee, and still allow the government to meet its stated objective. Now, I'm going to conclude by saying it's my understanding that the Liberals are going to vote against this motion. They're going to have to tell Canadians, explain to them why the voice of youth are not important to inform this bill, why the voice of ordinary Canadians are not important. And I want to stop and say on that this bill isn't for producers, it's not for dispensary owners, it's not for edible manufacturers. This bill is for the millions of Canadians who voted last election for the promise of legalization of cannabis. And to proceed with this bill without hearing from them is unacceptable. You know, the government side may argue, well, they heard from the task force. That was to inform the process. What I want to hear from are those people about this legislation. I think that they have a right, now that legislation has been drafted and tabled before Parliament, they have a right to now offer their comment on the actual proposals that have been before us, particularly when the government has ignored several recommendations of the task force in this legislation. So I really hope that the Liberal government will see fit to include these important voices. And if not, I hope they have a good explanation as to why these important voices are not important to be heard at this committee, where, I will conclude here, the difference is this. It's not enough to say that people can contact MPs on their own, or we can hold town halls, which many of us have done or are doing. To testify at this committee is to testify in front of the entire Health Committee, in public, recorded, televised, and in both languages. And that provides a unique opportunity to hear that voice that is not fully accommodated in any other fashion. So for all those reasons, Mr. Chair, I would urge my colleagues to support this very reasonable motion so that we can bring Canadians the best, safest, healthiest cannabis legislation that we can possibly craft as Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Sidhu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'll be speaking against this motion. And I want to remind this committee, my colleague, Mr. Davis, voted in favor of this motion when we set up the 5 days uninterrupted study. We are doing this. Our government ran campaign on this issue in 2015. 2016, Cannabis Task Force worked for 6 months, consulted over 30,000 Canadians, and traveled across the country and to the other jurisdiction. committee heard over 100 witnesses this week, including over 40 hours of testimony from government, law enforcement, medical community, researchers, scientists. Committee also received 100 written submissions. All three parties worked over this summer to build their witnesses list in preparation for this study. In addition, provinces and territories are doing their consultation. And I just want to thank you, Chair. Thank you all the colleagues. I think it's important piece of legislation. We should move forward.
Okay, Dr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Don for bringing this forward. I think well said, Don. Thank you for that. And he reiterated that in June we did vote against this. The Liberals wanted to kind of pigeonhole us into 5 different days with different topics, and we did want to hear from different groups, and Don has brought forward the names of some of those groups. At the end of the day, I think Canadians expect us to be looking at after the health and safety of Canadians. That's what this committee is all about. And if you listen repeatedly to the Liberal talking points, it's consistently they want to keep this out of the hands of kids, and they want to keep the proceeds away from organized crime. Throughout these witnesses we've heard, even from Liberal members, it's obvious that there are huge gaps in this bill. And if we don't get it right, we've heard it over and over again, this could actually make things worse for everybody in Canada. So I know we're going to hear the government come up and they're going to say, well, we've heard so many witnesses, the number of witnesses and that, they're going to compare it to other studies they did. Well, I'm not interested in that. These other studies, sometimes they were shut down as well. We were promised that the Liberals were open to more witnesses, and what this has done for me is really given me a perspective on how complicated this issue is, how different levels of government, they need to get the boots on the ground. They got to get these all prepared, and I think, as my Liberal colleagues have noticed, there are huge gaps in this bill. And I think we need a little bit more, let's say, perspective and make sure we get it right. That's the least we can do for Canadians. So, Don, we'll be supporting your motion.
I do.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to speak also in support of the motion. I was very disappointed this morning that when I suggested adding more meetings for more witnesses, that the Liberals shut that down. They keep saying they're not rushing, but it looks like they're rushing. And we haven't heard from Uruguay. It's the only country in the world other than us that's ever legalized marijuana. We should at least hear what they have to say. There are a number of other things that have come out through the testimony that have pointed out gaps that we would need to close, the border issue, the international treaty issue, a number of different things that are not addressed, the revenue sharing, things that we would need to hear more testimony on. And so thank you, Don, for bringing that forward, and I will be supporting.
Mr. Davies.
Just briefly, in response to Ms. Sidhu's comments, again, the original motion by the Liberals was to have 5 days of hearing only, and after deliberation, this committee changed that motion to say that there would be an initial 5 days of testimony plus the possibility of additional days, if necessary, and the Liberals agreed to that. Now, after 5 days of hearing, the Liberals are saying no, there's no more possibility of further days of hearing. So, if anything, it's the Liberals who are backtracking on the commitment made in June. And second, I'd like to say that, again, hearing from Canadians on the task force is not the same as hearing Canadians comment on the drafted legislation, particularly when the legislation deviates from the task force recommendations. And my one example is edibles. The task force said, for various reasons, after listening to 30,000 Canadians, studying the experience for the jurisdictions, they came to the considered and evidence-based position that this government should legalize edibles, and that's what Canadians told them, and then the government tables legislation that ignores that. I want to hear what Canadians have to say about that. And finally, again, I'll just say this, that, I don't need 50 and 60-year-olds telling me how to talk to a 16 and 17 and 18-year-old. I want to hear from the 16, 17, and 18-year-old what they think about cannabis. And I think to shut out that voice and not hear risks us doing a great disservice to all of the stated concerns that people have stated about the health of young Canadians. I'll just stop there, and I'm happy to proceed to a vote. If
all right.
my colleagues want that.
Seeing no more speakers, we'll call for a vote. All in favor of this?
I'd like a recorded vote, please.
I have a point of order, too.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, that here in Health Committee, we have certain members that are part of this committee, and I think it was tabled in the House, and I think officially Mr. Kang is still a member of this committee, and I'm not sure if the Liberal government can substitute another Liberal member. I know Mr. McKinnon's here, and I appreciate his input, very good input into the committee, but technically speaking, if the government party can actually substitute a member in for an independent, and then if that member actually has the right to vote. I was wondering if you could let us know the rules on that.
My ruling is that he can be substituted, and Mr. McKinnon is legitimate as a voting member of the committee. Mr. Davies.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure that I'm requesting a recorded vote, please, on my motion.
Okay, we go to a vote.
Monsieur Ayoub? Oui, sur la motion de Monsieur Davies. Dr. Ailson?
No.
Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Mr. Oliver?
No.
Ms. Sidhu? Dr. Carey? Ms. Gladue?
Yes.
Mr. Davies?
You betcha.
Nays contre 5, yes pour 3.
Motion defeated. So that's the end of meeting 68. Thanks very much, everybody.